Alright, gonna do another special video here. My reviews have been waylaid by the fact that my AC went out, so it's either been too goddamn hot in my room to film anything, or it would be too loud if I was running the portable AC I have in the meantime. So I'm just gonna do something that doesn't require any FaceTime, and apparently lists are popular on YouTube, so I guess I'll do one. Unfortunately, I can't do too many of them because I don't want to tip my hand, but I've already reviewed the main Yakuza franchise, which on that note, yes, I do have reviews for all the games covered, so feel free to check them out. Before we begin, this is only going to cover Yakuza 0 through 6. It won't cover anything after, basically the Kiryu saga. Yes, I'm aware it's called Like a Dragon in Japan, and it's also Like a Dragon elsewhere now, so none of the spin-offs. And that includes Dead Souls, that's a spin-off. I have not played the most recent Gaiden, even though that's actually called Like a Dragon, so technically it's not a Yakuza game. I hope to play it soon, but, well, that's why I'm actually replaying the Yakuza games right now. I was also not planning to include the Kiwami games on here, although I may throw them on as an appendum. I honestly haven't played them that much. I prefer the originals, because I'm a purist. There will be some spoilers. I avoid spoilers in reviews, but I don't think that applies here because why would someone who hasn't played the Yakuza games be interested in watching a ranking video? So yeah, if you are interested in playing the Yakuza games but you haven't, stop watching this video right now and just go play them. Come back later. I'll wait. Number 7. Yakuza. As in the very first one. I don't think this one is going to cause any controversy, aside from a possible implication that this could be a lacking game in any way. It's not. The worst Yakuza is still pretty awesome. I don't want to spoil my reviews, but I'd still give this game an A-. It's a really good game that just simply has way better sequels. Sequels that completely leapfrog it in every conceivable category. It's just that, by comparison, this game is lacking. This entry has the simplest plot by far, which isn't a problem in my eyes. I think the other ones might be too complicated, but at the same time, yeah, it's not really all that special either, and the game does lack a fair amount of the charm of the sequels. Out of all the games, this one definitely takes itself the most serious. There's a few jokes to lighten things up, but it doesn't really have any of the goofiness of the later games, which is most obvious in the sub-stories, which are actually pretty mundane in this one. I don't remember exactly how long the game is, but I think it's considerably shorter than even the second one. The overall content in the game is certainly a lot less, from the number of sub-stories, the side activities, and especially your arsenal of moves. I could be wrong, but it did feel a little bit lacking, which is most painful in the Colosseum, because your options there are already a bit limited. With one or two exceptions, you can't have any weapons. Nearly all of the enemies will break out of your holds. And in one tournament, you can't even attack the enemy on the ground. So your ability to do good moves is limited. You should not attempt the Colosseum until you know the Kamaki moves. A lot of the environments you fight in have no weapons. But most importantly, the combat itself is a bit rough around the edges. At times, I even found it frustrating. There's at least one boss with a taser super glued to his hand, and a lot of the big motherfuckers will easily knock you down with their charging attacks. And getting 100%, or at least fighting Amon, requires a bit of foreknowledge because a number of missions can be missed completely. They'll only appear at 1 or 2 points in the entire story. If you don't get it done then, you can't get it done ever. And a few of the missions have time limits that you are not warned about at all, and there's no rhyme or reason to which missions are timed and which ones are not. I'm not going to comment on the quality values themselves because that goes without saying. I would sure hope the sequels have better quality values, but there is one more thing to point out. It's the only entry that didn't even have an option for the Japanese dub when it was brought to North America. Some of the later games would give you the option, but this one is strictly in English, which also makes this entry a bit of a black sheep. And the dub certainly has problems. While I've never heard the Japanese dub, if the sequels are any indication, I'm sure it was perfectly passable. Now, apart from that, they also changed a few names in the translation. I don't really have an opinion. In fact, I can agree with a couple, like Shintaro Fuma was originally Shintaro Kazama. Kiryu is Kazuma It's very easy to confuse considering their relationship. So there you have it, the first game is the worst. I think we can all probably agree on that. So let's move on to number 6, Yakuza 2. Now this one might cause some controversy. It's actually a pretty popular entry. Needless to say, I don't think so, but apparently the story is pretty widely liked. But again, I don't really consider this one of the better stories in the franchise. But I will say on the plus side, the characters are definitely strong. Ryuji Goda might very well be the best villain in the franchise. And then of course you had Kiryu team up with a female cop who fucking hates the Yakuza. Yeah, it's a cliche, but damned if it didn't work. Unfortunately, I can't say that the rest of the story does. For starters, it is ridiculously convoluted. I'm talking Metal Gear Solid convoluted. While it's nowhere near as complicated, it's every bit as absurd. While the story is a lot less predictable than its predecessor, it's just ridiculously complicated with all the betrayals and allegiances going on. There's a few points that I just found to be massive eye rollers. The worst part is definitely when Kiryu has to go to a building to rescue Daigo. Meanwhile, Date and the police were investigating Kazuki for something else, and they end up chasing him to the exact same building where they all meet up and have this standoff where it's revealed that there's an imposter Kazuki, but fortunately Date shoots the imposter instead, which just happens to end up on camera in such a way that it paints Date in a bad light, so he ends up wanted for murder for some reason. I mean, it looks like self-defense to me, and there's a few other parts that don't make sense, like where Kiryu gets stabbed by this guy, and someone also slips a note into his pocket, presumably the same person. I don't get it. Was the stabbing not supposed to kill him? Did someone else slip the note in his pocket? Then there was the Jingwan Mafia hit. Apparently Shimano and Shintaro single-handedly took on a gang of 36 people. Oh yeah, and Kiryu happened to be there, which thereby makes him indirectly responsible for some of what went down, because he was being protected by his foster father, even though they're nowhere in the same area at this moment. And what's worse is that the story has the same problem as its predecessor, which I didn't address yet. There's a couple of parts where it just comes to a complete screeching halt, and you do shit that is either tangentially connected or not connected at all, because I doubt anybody wanted to see the florist's son again. But on the plus side, it doesn't take itself as seriously as the first game. It starts to get more outlandish here, and later games would totally run with that. But enough of the story. Ultimately, what I grade games on are the gameplay. And on that note, this game is a marked improvement on its predecessor, much bigger in scope, not just in terms of the story and the length of the main campaign. You got way more side activities and side missions, way more moves to do, and the rough edges of the previous game were greatly sanded down. They're not completely gone, but I didn't find this game to be frustrating at all. In particular, I don't remember anyone tasering me. I'm pretty certain the big guys still have the ability to knock you down, but again, I didn't find it anywhere near as annoying as the first game. Nearly every place you fight will have at least one weapon to pick up. That all being said, it's improved, but it is running on the same engine. On another note of improvement, there really aren't any missable sub-stories this time around. I think there's only one. Apparently, if you talk to this guy a ridiculous amount of times, you'll actually just simply fight him and go into the Mahjong Palace, and as a result, you'll miss out on a mission. I haven't tried this myself, because why would I? It's not like this guy's dialogue changes, so why would you think to talk to him repeatedly? But on the other hand, completing all the sub-stories is quite arduous in this game, and some of the missions are still timed. Fortunately, most of the hardest missions are not required to fight Amon, but there's still a couple, like the one at the golf range, where you have to hit a moving target with 8 out of 10 shots. And then there's the Kamaki missions, where you have to fight every single opponent in the Coliseum, which in turn will require you to perform every single heat action that is physically possible within a new game. And now that I think about it, some of the heat actions can only be performed at one point in the entire story, so those missions are missable. It is totally not worth the effort. I did it once, and then I made a save file that I would specifically load when I get to that point in the game. God damn, what were they thinking? And while still on the subject of Kamaki, learning his moves is the worst in the franchise. First is the method itself. Most of the moves are learned when you're in Osaka. so you can only learn it at specific times in the story. It's not very intuitive, and you'll also learn the best moves way too damn late, namely the Tiger Drop. You really should have been able to learn this earlier. Also, the parts where you're carrying someone who's bleeding out are trial and error. You'll probably fail them on your first try until you learn to avoid the people that waste your time. Alright, I think that's enough. Let's just move on to number 5. Yakuza 3. Now we're starting to get into more blurry territory. Although I think overall this isn't a controversial pick. Unlike Yakuza 2, it seems that a lot of fans rank this as one of the lower entries. So it might be a hot take to say that in some ways I consider this one of the best entries. Now, why do I think that? Well, let's start off with the story. I think this is probably what most people hold against the game. This is without a doubt the second most simple story in the franchise. It's surprisingly straightforward, especially compared to its immediate predecessor. Although I wouldn't say it's any less ridiculous. Story kicks off with Kiryu running an orphanage in Okinawa. One day the Yakuza knock on his door looking for him to relocate. And what do you know, it turns out to be the Tojo clan themselves. But then suddenly it appears that Shintaro is still alive. Except not really, turns out this guy is actually the brother of Shintaro. And he's a CIA agent. Because you just ended up in the middle of a massive CIA operation. Wow. I did not see that coming. Now, to be completely honest, this is actually the kind of story I prefer in Yakuza. Absurd, but still conceivable somehow. But I'm not saying that it's a great story by any means either. And I'm certainly not saying that it doesn't have issues. The biggest one being that, like its predecessors, it occasionally comes to a complete screeching halt while you do shit that is only tangentially connected to the main plot. But it is better than the previous game because these diversions involve the children that Kiryu is looking after. So they're both tangentially related to the plot, and they also have resonance of the subject matter. That all being said, they are poorly paced out. Pretty much every kid has their own sub-story, except Koji, because I guess apparently he's got his shit all together. And it's not uncommon for you to have 2 or even 3 of these back-to-back. So sometimes they kind of drag. I think they would have been better off as sub-stories. But on the positive side, I think this game has the emotional high points of the series. I don't think they're ever going to top Rikia's death. I don't think I've ever come any closer to shedding manly tears. Who knows, maybe I did actually shed tears. I'm not telling. It also features the death of Kashiwagi. Sadly, Kashiwagi didn't make a whole lot of appearances in the first 2 games, especially the first. He was really only in 2 scenes. I did not experience the games in a timely fashion, so I played Yakuza 1, 2, and 3 pretty much back to back. So when I played this one, I didn't really remember who he was. Aside from that, you've also got Mine, who's definitely one of the best characters. As you go through the story, you just can't really pin down whether or not he's ultimately going to be on your side in the end. But of course, Yakuza games are not judged on their stories, they're judged on their gameplay. And Yakuza 3 is a quantum leap over the first 2 games. Running on a brand new engine, and God does it make the game so much better. The cities in this game are no longer broken up into smaller areas. It's now just one continuous area with no loading whatsoever. Outside of going into a building, of course. But on the other hand, the game barely even has to load when you get into a fight. The fights actually begin right where you stand. Although they do have to load after the fight. But you can't have it all. Naturally, the fights themselves have a brand new engine. So all the problems of the previous game have been fixed. But admittedly, the new system does introduce 1 or 2 quirks. In particular, the game does seem pretty picky about doing certain heat actions, or more specifically that enemies are protected from getting heat actioned. As a result, it's really hard to do them sometimes. This installment now introduces the ability for characters to bounce off walls and get juggled around a bit, which occasionally gets a bit annoying, but otherwise is nothing serious. It just happens and then it's done. The sub-stories get slightly improved. There's still a few missable ones, but none of them have crazy requirements. And the only mission that has a time limit explicitly tells you this. Now, if I really wanted to, I could complain about how this may very well have the worst climax challenges in the entire franchise, but I'm not 100% certain on that, and I don't think that's a big enough deal. But what definitely can drag this game down and justify its low position is the fact that this game was heavily trimmed down for the original North American release, and probably elsewhere outside of Japan as well. I'm not entirely certain. A ton of content was cut, not just side activities, but a huge number of side missions. Now, some of the missions were justified because they were directly connected to cut content, but a lot of them were not. And there was no attempt to reconcile the fact that you are missing out on a ton of experience. Meaning you have to make up that entire difference with grinding. And I'm not even sure how feasible it would have been in the full version. Now to repeat, this is the original non-Japanese PS3 versions I'm talking about right here. The more recent remasters have nearly everything put back into the game. There was at least one mission that could not be put in the game unless they did extensive reworking. And then there were a few other missions that were all part of a storyline that was considered insensitive in this time and age. God, I miss the 90s. Now, I'm not entirely certain how much I should weigh that against the game because it was a regional issue, not a universal one. But I do think it's fair to assess a penalty that would definitely put it below Yakuza's 4 and 5. Number 4, Yakuza 6. Alright, this next one is a floater. I have not made up my mind where exactly it should go. I might even put this below Yakuza 3, but it's a very intensely personal decision. I would like to start off by saying that this is still a fantastic game worthy of the Yakuza name, but I was definitely disappointed with this entry. But first, let's start off with the positives. I do like the story in this one. 7 games in, I would say this story falls right in the middle in terms of simplicity versus complexity. It's more complex than 4, but it is nowhere near as complicated as everything else above it. The story might be a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but it's certainly nowhere near as egregious as the other offenders on this list. Outside of that, it's definitely a story on par with the others, with a little bit of a change of pace. In particular, a number of key characters don't return in this one, which can either be good or bad depending on how you look at it. It is a little weird that not many key Tojo members appear, but on the other hand, it's nice that characters aren't just shoehorned in for no reason. It's also nice to see another Yakuza family beside the Tojo or the Omi. It's got a really nice running theme of fatherhood, or parenthood if you want to be gender neutral, which gives it a little bit of emotional heft. And on that note, it also has one of my favorite Kiryu moments in the entire franchise. I didn't spoil it in the review, but I love this scene where Kiryu just goes apeshit over the baby. It's one of the few times where they really let Kiryu's flaws come to the surface. While I can totally sympathize with Kiryu, I have to side with Akiyama. Dude, what are you doing? This is not the time to be babysitting. Although I do gotta single out one of the craziest pieces of dialogue I have ever heard. Now as for the gameplay, it is quite fortuitous that I already spoke about Yakuza 3, because this game has another quantum leap over its predecessors. This game has a brand new engine, and it's pretty fucking awesome. Now the entire city, including the indoors, is all one big map with absolutely no loading screens, with the exception of a few key areas. And not to do a deep dive on it, but it's nice that they added so many more restaurants throughout the map of Kamurocho, whereas in previous games there were very few restaurants north of the Millennium Tower. The combat also has a massive upgrade due to the new engine. You've got more elaborate physics, the environments are more varied, and they even have certain environmental effects. Although, while that's cool and all, I have to say that I do prefer the simpler physics of earlier games. And I will say right now, that is entirely a personal choice on my behalf. I shouldn't really hold it against the game, but there certainly are things that I can hold against this game. I definitely don't think the weapon should have been one and done if you use a heat action. The game is overall also way too easy. As long as you reasonably keep on top of upgrading your stats, you're not going to have much of a challenge outside of the bosses, who actually put up a decent fight. But still, depending on how you level yourself up, you could be massively overpowered. But this entry's biggest flaw is the fact that the new entry meant that the team had to spend too much time getting the engine up and running, as opposed to making this the grandest Yakuza yet. And it's a damn shame, because this was meant to be Kiryu's big send-off, but it actually ended up being smaller in scope. I'm pretty certain the overall story is shorter. It definitely took me like only half the amount of time as it took me to beat Zero, but that could have been due to a couple of side activity time sinks. But while on the subject of both of those things, the story does end up putting some restrictions on when you can do certain side activities, like baseball. And on this entry, there were a number of times where I wanted to do a specific side activity, but it wasn't available at that time of day. And then you ended up going to the other city where it wasn't available at all. In addition to that, the number of sub-stories in this game is much lower than Zero. And what's more is that many of the side activities are actually directly related to one another, but perhaps worst of all is the number of heat actions is lower than previous games, which makes the combat feel a lot less varied. Alright, I think that's enough. I don't want to go too in-depth on any particular game, but Yakuza 6 exists in a bit of a limbo for me. I just don't really know where I'd put it. Even though it's totally better than 1 and 2, in some ways, this is my least favorite game to play. That's just simply how much I don't really care for the new system. I don't remember if any of the side quests were especially annoying in this one, but I do think it has the second best Hostess Club system in the franchise, which was my least favorite part of any game. But to keep it moving along here, number 3, Yakuza 4. Alright, y'all remember when I said that things started to get blurry? Even disregarding 6, which is a total wild card, I'm a little hard-pressed to say I like this more than 3. But I certainly could come up with a couple of reasons. And starting off with the story, man was this entry a complete change of pace. This was the first entry to have multiple protagonists besides Kiryu. And I gotta say, I really like it. Both the style and the story in general. The 4 different characters have quite a bit of contrast between them. Saijuma's definitely a more hardcore Yakuza. And then you've got Tanemura, the semi-dirty cop. Technically speaking, he is taking payoffs, he is turning a blind eye to certain things, but it's ultimately all to benefit the Chinese immigrants in Japan. In the grand scheme of things, I would say this falls on the simpler side. It's way more complicated than 1 and 3, but it's not as complicated as 6, or anything else. Which is funny, because I find this one to have the hardest plot to sum up in a single sentence. Yakuza 1, the 20 billion yen. Yakuza 2, the Omi Alliance. Yakuza 3, the land deal. Yakuza 5, the missing chairman. Yakuza 0, the empty lot. Yakuza 6, Haruka and her child. Yakuza 4, some guy gets shot. There was this hit like 20 years ago. Police corruption. I don't know. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, mind you. Just making an observation. And still, it's not a particularly complicated story. It's got plenty of twists. Some of the characters are playing 4-dimensional chess, but it is nowhere near as crazy as Yakuza 2 or anything that came after. Honestly, I would say it's just complicated enough without going over the top. That being said, the rubber bullets plot twist was fucking stupid. To be fair, the idea itself isn't terrible, but logically the way it plays out just makes no sense. I guess the whole plan banked upon Saejima not shooting anyone in the head, or noticing that nobody's bleeding. I really like the 4 protagonists. I wish it was more chronological, although I definitely have to say this one has the weakest finale. On the plus side, it's nothing like the first 3 finales, which all basically unfolded the same way. You went to a skyscraper, you'll fight at least 2 main bad guys, one of which is always a Yakuza, and at the very end, the main bad guy will try to kill you, at which point the designated Yakuza gets back up with a heroic second wind, attacks the true villain, gets shot several times in the process, and saves your life at the expense of their own. So it's nice to see something brand new, but it's a little bit anticlimactic. There's no gauntlet you have to run through first. Tanemura has to fight all of Munakata's goons, but that's it. Which is honestly kind of hilarious. Kiryu fights Daigo, Saejima fights Kido, Akiyama fights Arai, and Tanemura fights Munakata and all of his henchmen. What, you guys couldn't help him out at all? Although otherwise, I wouldn't really say this is one of the better stories. It's not bad, but It's nothing great either, but hey, it's got a lot of competition. Of course, it all really comes down to the gameplay. Having 4 playable characters was a nice change of pace. This entry also has my personal favorite leveling system. I just like that it's almost entirely non-linear. This was also the first entry to do away with all the missable missions. And while it's kind of a low blow, nothing got cut from the North American version of this game, at least not that I know of. And I also found the combat to be cleaned up a little bit. I didn't find heat actions nearly as hard to pull off as they were in the previous game. My biggest complaint is that it's really just a marginally better Yakuza 3. It's running on the exact same engine. Kamurocho is exactly the same. What's more, this game takes place entirely in Kamurocho, minus a few one-off areas. If you wanted to be mean, you could say that this is the laziest Yakuza sequel. So yeah, that's where I stand on that. I think it's slightly better than Yakuza 3, but only by such a small amount that I might just actually give the Yakuza 3 the edge because it came first, and therefore seems more impressive. Honestly, I might even call it a tie. Where that leaves 6 is anyone's guess. But I'm pretty certain I know what comes next. Number 2. Yakuza 5. Despite what I just said, this one still kind of exists within wiggle room of Yakuza 3. Yeah, it's pretty complicated. 3, 4, and 5 are all pretty close to me. But while I don't know whether or not I really like 3 or 4 better, I definitely like 5 more than 4. So I guess logically it must be better than 3 as well. And this entry is just a veritable bonanza of content. It's really amazing how much variety is in this installment. Would have been nice if they spent a little bit of that time improving the chase sequences. Alright, story-wise, like 4, you've got multiple protagonists, 5 of them this time. And once again, everyone has their own thread that interlocks into one single canvas. In this game's case, though, it's way more complicated. And it's also completely fucking bonkers at times. But I mean, it's Yakuza 5, you know what to expect at this point. Still, there were a few parts that had me shaking my head. And the story gets so complicated that it doesn't even always make sense. Okay, so Kujihara was sent to prison to provoke Sajima into attacking him, thereby extending his sentence. Suddenly, they also arrange for a bunch of other inmates to come, cause a prison riot, and try to kill Sajima, which necessitates him escaping the prison. However, that also turns out to be part of the plan. Now, apparently, it was an adjustment. They originally wanted him to stay longer, but then they had to release him early. Okay, that makes sense, but Kujihara does try to kill Sajima. Granted, I guess he went off script. Okay, that much is making sense, but who were the guys on the snowmobiles outside? Why were they chasing him? He was supposed to escape, right? Then there's at least one double twist, like the secretive Nagoya family that no one even knows if it really exists. Turns out it does exist, but it's just a bunch of civilians pretending to be Yakuza. So in effect, they keep the Yakuza from actually coming in the first place. But then it turns out that there really is actually a proper Nagoya Yakuza family. I guess it's not explicitly stated, but it seems to be an actual thing. I mean, technically it's not a plot hole then, it's just not explained clearly at any point. If you really are a Yakuza group, why have random civilians do your dirty work? Just do it yourself. On the positive side, it has one of the biggest bombshells of the franchise. Would you have ever suspected that Majima was married at some point? And it also has the second greatest moment for Sajima. While I'm a bit disappointed that Sajima basically mellows into a slightly darker version of Kiryu, what he does to Kujihara is just fucking brutal. This is something Kiryu would have never done. The new guy Shinada's interesting. And he's certainly an unusual pick, a disgraced baseball player. I still really wish it was more chronological. I think it would have made some of the plot points harder to connect logically earlier than you probably should have. As for the gameplay, it's another improvement on the 4th game, a bit more so than it was from 3 to 4. It's actually got a new engine, although it doesn't really change anything aside from some fancier physics. I also think it has the best Hostess Club mechanics. In the previous games, you had to max out a meter, but if you fucked up the very last question, you'd have to come back to fill it back up. But in this one, you can get some leeway. All the different playable characters have far more personality to them. They've all got their own special abilities. They have a wider range of attributes. They even each have their own unique city to run around in. Except for Haruka and Akiyama. The one thing that I really gotta knock this game for, while the game is bigger in scope than its predecessors, the game itself is just not quite big enough for that scope. They increased the level cap, but getting to the maximum level is going to require some grinding with every single character. Some way more than others, like Akiyama, who really does get the short end of the stick. He is by far given the least to do. He gets the least amount of story time. He actually shares a chapter with Haruka. He doesn't have another story. I was a bit disappointed that the leveling up system regressed to earlier games, where it was more linear, even if it still did use the point system from the fourth game. But now it is time for number 1, Yakuza 0. Yeah, you probably noticed a recognizable pattern here. I do believe that overall this franchise just keeps getting better and better, with the sole exception of 6 and arguably 4. But more to the point, I don't think anyone expected anything else to be in first place. I think this is widely considered to be the best, and I don't see how I could really argue. Simply put, it's the culmination of all the work Sega has put into Yakuza previously. Making the jump to the PS4, it had a brand new, far more impressive engine, which made all the action sequences even better. I would say it has one of the better stories, even if it does lean a little bit on the overly complicated and absurd side. The story still doesn't hit the emotional highs of the third game, but it's got some pretty high points nonetheless. In the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't say it's too high, but the villains are good, the overall story is good, if a little overly convoluted and ridiculous. It was great to see Kashiwagi again, and in a bigger role, but my biggest complaint might just be that it's a bit similar to the original game. There's a lot of parallels, and if I wanted to nitpick, a few things just don't really quite seem to line up with the later entries, even though they're technically earlier entries. This game occurs first in the chronology. It is a bit hard to swallow that Kiryu goes back to the Dojima family after this, and it's also a little bit hard to reconcile Majima's behavior in this, being that he doesn't really act like the mad dog he would be in the first game. He acts more like his mellow version from the fourth game onward. And also like Saejima, while he's a much darker character than Kiryu, he ultimately ends up acting more like Kiryu in this version. It's a bit of an odd choice, because I would bet that we were all waiting to play as the mad dog of freaking Shimano. But in the end, it doesn't even matter, because it's all about the gameplay, and yeah, I already said it, the gameplay is just fucking awesome in this one. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of the style system, I definitely preferred the previous game where there was just one style and you could do anything you want at any given time, whereas the styles just limit your options at any given time. I would also say that the leveling up system is one of my favorites. Overall, it's very open-ended, but considerably less so than the fourth game. I would definitely say that some abilities are massively overpriced. Heat actions should not cost that much. There's just one thing I miss compared to the previous games. They really toned down all the NPCs you could talk to on the street. It's not a big deal, but I miss it. It's a staple of previous games, and it's a staple of the genre. Oh wait, I have to take that back. A couple of the side missions are a little bit crazy. I'm talking about you, Pocket Circuit Racer, but I think I've spoken enough. Now that you have my full list, you're probably ready to go. But I guess maybe I could address the 2 Kiwami entries. Now, while admittedly I haven't played them a whole lot compared to the other games, I would be inclined to say that they just might be better than 0. Now, if you don't know, Kiwami is a remake of the first game, except it came out after 0. The first Kiwami is running on the exact same engine. It plays pretty much the same. It's got the style switching. Still not a fan, but it might just actually be better in this entry. Most specifically, the ability to switch between all 4 styles without having to go into the menu. And while the leveling up is handled like it was in 0, it goes back to using experience points instead of money. And shockingly enough, unlike 0, it has a whole bunch of NPCs on the street to talk to. Now, as for the story, it was expanded upon slightly. Not by much, but there are some additional scenes that flesh out Nishiki more. Oh, and Kashiwagi even gets to appear a few more times, which I greatly appreciate. I know some people didn't like it because I guess they thought it maybe justified him too much or it explained too much. But personally, I think it's something that we deserved after Zero. The lack of any backstory was okay when Yakuza was the very first game and we knew nothing about these characters beforehand. But after Zero confirmed that these two guys were thick as brothers, I do think we needed at least something of an explanation. I did think the Dr. Twist was a little bit much. The biggest shortcoming of the game is the fact that it's a bit short on content because it's a remake of the very first. They added a lot of content from the other games, but that only goes so far. But hey, it is nice to play a game that isn't going to take you a month to beat. And then there's Kiwami 2, which I haven't even played since I platinumed it way back in the day. As a chronological note, Kiwami 2 came out after Yakuza 6. And I gotta say, it's probably no surprise that it just might be the best Yakuza game yet. Now, being a remake of 2, I seem to recall some of the troublesome missions are still a bit troublesome. I think the story changes were very minor this time around. My memory is hazy, but if I remember correctly, I think it actually fixed all the problems I had with Yakuza 6. I think they brought back nearly all the heat actions. I'd have to play it again to be sure, but I remember thinking that Kiwami 2 was everything that Yakuza 6 should have been. The only thing that I would really complain about is the fact that they made some pretty galling omissions from the original game. They actually removed an entire section of the city. That was really disappointing. So Sega, Yakuza 6 Kiwami, do it. Or hell, could you just have a Kiwami 2 patch for 6?